The Empress Returns, by Iowa Forever. Chapter 1.10, The Heart of Mankind. Twilight spent as much time as she could practicing with her new sword. Matthias and the others had said it was old, but Twilight did not care for age. It was lighter than any sword she had encountered before, well balanced for its intended purpose, and whoever had forged it had etched a beautiful flowing pattern into the guard, the center adorned by a small twin-headed eagle. She could have done without the golden skull and the pommel, but that was something she had come to expect of humanity, with death surrounding them in a myriad of forms. Embracing it seemed the only way for them to stay sane. Princess Celestia had not commented on that when Twilight brought the issue to her. In fact, as they drew closer to Terra, it was a rare sight to see Celestia at all. She remained in her room while Twilight wandered about to explore, and could not be found in any of the public areas that the crew frequented. When Twilight approached her room, Celestia did little to make her presence known, not even responding when Twilight called to her. The sun is resting below the horizon, the psyker that traveled with Matthias, Angelique, had said when Twilight caught her curled up outside Celestia's room. But soon it shall rise, and cast a new dawn over a darkened world. Angelique had soon been ushered away by her caretaker, but the message would rest on Twilight's mind. She's probably just resting for when we reach Terra, Twilight reasoned. She needs time to prepare whatever she has in mind to save the humans, right? Twilight's answer came soon enough. She could feel the cruiser slowing, warp drive quieting as sublight engines were reactivated. No sooner had Twilight detected the change that she heard a knock at her door. "Hello? It's me, Twilight," Celestia replied. Twilight hopped off her bed and hurried to the door, taking only the briefest of moments to compose herself before opening the door and allowing Celestia to enter. Celestia was once more dressed in a gray cloak, the hood pulled up to hide her face, yet Twilight could still see her smile beneath the shadows. "I suppose you noticed that we are slowing down?" "Yes," Twilight nodded. "We're nearing Terra?" "Correct." Celestia drew back her hood before continuing. "I stopped by to make sure you are ready for all that you may see there." "I think you've more than prepared me," Twilight replied, giving a small smile. The smile faded as Celestia failed to return it. "In my experience, there is little that can prepare one from an alien realm. Terra has fallen far from the splendor I have told you of, and may prove strange even to me. What you see may shock and distress you, but remember why we are here. To make sure humanity doesn't die out," Twilight said, her confidence returning as Celestia gave a short nod. "Don't worry, Princess. You asked me to help, and I won't stop until I have done all I can to help these people." "That is all I wanted to hear, Twilight," Celestia replied, placing a hand on Twilight's shoulder. "You continue to amaze me with how far you have grown from when we first met, and I am proud to call you my student." Twilight beamed, her smile not wavering even as Celestia removed her hand and turned towards the door. "Come, the Inquisitors will be waiting for us." "Oh." Twilight took a moment to recover her sword from where she had placed it the previous night before hurrying to fall in place next to Celestia. "You don't like Inquisitor Marcos, do you?" "What makes you say that?" Celestia asked. Twilight had known Celestia long enough to detect the subtle amusement drifting through her words. "Well, I kind of saw you two arguing when I got my sword," Twilight said. "And he glares at me whenever we're near each other, and since he's never actually taken time to talk to me I figured that he was angry at me for something you did." Twilight noticed Celestia's slight shift in gaze before backtracking. That's what I guessed, anyway." "You are not far from the truth, Twilight." Celestia looked ahead before continuing. "Inquisitor Marcos is most suspicious about who I am and whether or not I am truly the Emperor's herald." "Why? You haven't done anything wrong, have you?" "I may have made a few less than savory observations about his faith, nothing more." There was a pause before Celestia spoke again. "The Inquisition rose out of necessity, not choice. I had been entombed within the Golden Throne for many years by the time it reached its current state, corrupt and paranoid." "Matthias isn't paranoid." Twilight started. "I mean, he's asked me a lot of questions, but he's never accused me of anything. You even said he wasn't paranoid." "Matthias is young, Twilight, that is a different set of problems entirely." Twilight looked away for a moment, a frown forming on her face. There's nothing wrong with being young, she thought. There is no need to worry, but remain alert. The Inquisition will attack anything that it perceives as a threat towards the Imperium or itself, and it will use any information it can to justify its attack. "Matthias wouldn't do that," Twilight said quickly. "Not everyone has to be paranoid if they want to protect their home." Celestia was silent for a moment, her focus directed ahead, before a small smile formed on her lips. "With you at my side, there might yet be hope for humanity," she whispered as they stepped into the main hangar. Matthias and his retinue were standing before the cutter, Angelique staring off into space while Matthias reviewed Alexis and Nikolai. The two soldiers were now dressed in black and silver armor, their shoulders marked with the stylized eye of the Inquisition, while Matthias wore a smaller, slimmer version of the armor Celestia wore. He turned slightly to acknowledge Twilight and Celestia's presence, but it was only fleeting before he turned back to the soldiers. "And keep a close eye on Lord Marcos," he finished. "I respect the Lord Inquisitor, but he has been making numerous private communiques since we entered the Sol system. It's possible that the Ordo Hereticus may try to usurp control of the situation from us, and that might lead to further divisions that the Imperium does not need right now." "Yes, sir," Nikolai replied. Alexis, however, had other ideas. "Can we just cut our ties with the Inquisitor?" he offered. "If he's really causing so much tension, why not just conduct the Herald to Terra ourselves and leave him behind?" "Marcos has become too involved in the mission for that," Matthias countered. "Also, that might be considered treasonous to certain ears. Refrain from saying anything negative about the Lord Inquisitor for the time being." "Yes, sir." Alexis nodded. Now, Matthias turned his attention to Twilight and Celestia. "I see you're ready for the trip," he said, turning his full attention towards Celestia. "My superiors have arranged for you to make your case before the High Lords." "How long will I have?" Celestia asked. 30 minutes. Matthias shrugged. "I know it must not seem like much, but if it reveals the location of the Emperor, then it may be more than enough time." "It is more than sufficient." "Glad to hear." Matthias turned his attention to Twilight. "Terra, however, will have to remain with my followers while you speak to the High Lords. I made a request from the armory, and this carapace armor should be about your size." Matthias stepped aside, revealing a boxy set of armor similar to what Alexis and Nikolai were wearing until further notice. "You are officially an agent of His Holy Ordos under my command. Hopefully this will not draw much attention, but there are always those who might be a bit more intrusive." Twilight swallowed, but gave a short nod before stepping over towards the armor, placing her sword on the deck where she could recover it later. Nikolai and Alexis moved to assist her while Matthias turned once more to Celestia. The armor was a bit heavier than Twilight had thought it would be, her arms sagging slightly as she lifted up the breastplate. "You'll get used to it," Alexis said, taking the armor from Twilight before slipping it over her head, tightening the straps once her arms were free. Twilight gave a nod of thanks before moving on to other segments of the armor, securing the plates around her waist and thighs while the Valhallans secured her shoulder plates. Once they were finished, the two stepped back while Twilight took a moment to try and move around. The armor at least did not stop her from moving around, though it did press down on her shoulders more than she would have liked. She made a small circle of the space around her, just a slow walk to try and get used to the armor's weight. That task complete, she reached down and picked up her sword from where it rested, twisting it around in her hand for a moment before attaching it to a clip at her side. It would take some getting used to, but at least Twilight felt safe. "Are you finished now?" Twilight looked up as Lord Marcos strode into the room. He was dressed similarly to Matthias, though his armor was coated in red and black instead of Matthias' green and silver. Twilight took several steps back, stopping once she was sure she was at Celestia's side once more. "We do not wish to keep the Lords of Terra waiting, now do we?" "Of course," Matthias said, his voice colder than Twilight was used to. "Is there anything else you wish to say, Lord Marcos?" "At the moment, no," Marcos replied. "Though rest assured, I have taken some extra precautions to make sure that our meeting with the High Lords goes smoothly." Twilight noticed Matthias tense slightly. She refrained from saying anything, lest it draw Inquisitor Marcos' anger. Celestia, though, remained calm as ever, even as the Inquisitor cast his gaze towards her. "Everything has been secured," Matthias said, breaking a bit of the tension before he gestured towards the ship. "Miss Celeste, Lord Marcos, if you would please?" "Of course, Matthias," Celestia replied, giving Twilight a gentle nudge towards the cutter. Twilight kept her head down, not even looking up from her feet as Alexis and Nikolai formed up alongside them. "The mare walks on paths of broken glass," Angelique mumbled. "But she need not worry, for the light guides her path." Twilight paused long enough to give the psyker a glance, but Angelique was soon ushered away by Sister Bianca before she could say more. Twilight shook her head and continued on, finding a chair in the main hall of the cutter. Celestia remained standing, her eyes closed as if meditating, while Alexis and Nikolai found their own space before the ship lifted off from the hangar. "Terra," Alexis whispered. "Never thought we'd live long enough to see the cradle of mankind." Nikolai replied with a short grunt before closing his eyes and whispering a prayer beneath his breath. It took Alexis a moment before joining his brother, the two soldiers clutching their weapons close to their chests as they gave their praises. Twilight watched them in silence, trying and failing to discern what the two were saying. As the soldiers prayed, Twilight cast a glance over at Celestia. She still kept her eyes closed, but now it seemed as though a light had enveloped her, wrapping around her body like a cloak. Whether it was a side effect of her powers or from the prayers of the others, Twilight was unsure. This world seemed to bring new changes to it every day, and little time for her to record anything for better understanding. Perhaps, once Celestia revealed herself as the Empress, she would have time to do so. The ship lurched, Twilight grabbing the side of her chair to keep from being flung to the floor. Celestia shifted only slightly, while Alexis and Nikolai also steadied themselves against the wall. "Looks like we just broke Atmo," Alexis said. "Won't be too long before we're on the ground." "I don't think I will ever get used to that," Twilight mumbled. "Hey, you didn't throw up at least," Alexis said, grinning. "I remember we were doing an operation near the Halo stars, and this one guy, Pietro I think his name was, vomited the whole way down to the planet. The commissar almost shot him dead as a hazard to the mission before we landed." Twilight gave a small whimper as Alexis chuckled. "Alexis," Nikolai started. "You're not helping." "What?" "Someone needs to lighten the mood," Alexis countered. Nikolai merely gave Alexis a short glare, the other Valhallan shrugging as the rattling stopped. Minutes ticked by, Twilight's eyes once more darting between the others in the room, before Matthias stepped out from the next hall. "We just got clearance to land at the Imperial Palace," he said. "Once we're on the ground, I want everyone to stick close to me. I have no idea what Lord Marcos has planned, and while I doubt it is a malicious scheme, it might tip the balance too far out of our control." "Worry not, Matthias," Celestia said, finally open her eyes. "Soon, you will no longer have to fear the machinations of Lord Marcos." "We shall see." Matthias turned to Twilight. "How are you holding up, Terra?" "I'm fine." Twilight gave a short nod. "Good. As you're acting under my command, I'd like you to keep an eye on Marcos as well." His face grew serious. "And whatever you do, do not use your psychic abilities, whatever they may be. Marcos is a trained member of the Ordo Hereticus, and he would know well the manipulations of the Psyker and the Witch." "I'd never use my M-powers to manipulate anyone," Twilight mumbled. "Marcos doesn't know that." Matthias turned away from Twilight. "Now look alive, we should be landing soon." Alexis and Nikolai nodded, readying their weapons while Matthias disappeared, most likely to speak with Angelique and Sister Bianca. Once Matthias was gone, Twilight rose to her feet, taking a moment to readjust to her new armor's weight before crossing towards Celestia. Celestia was still a stable point. That, at least, Twilight could take comfort in. Angelique and Sister Bianca returned just as the ship bounced slightly. "We must have landed," Twilight though, trying her best to clear her mind. Angelique gave Twilight a glance, her head cocked to one side as she eyed Twilight up and down. "Breathe deep," the Psyker said. "For the mare will not know of the air." Thank you?" Twilight started. "Though Angelique may be a bit odd in her wording," Bianca said. "She is not wrong. From what I have heard, many a visitor to Terra has had difficulty breathing in the first few hours of arrival. I will stay close to you if you wish." I think I'll manage," Twilight replied. "I mean, best get it out of the way quickly, right?" Bianca did not return Twilight's smile, but said nothing to correct her. Soon Matthias and Marcos returned, the Ordo Hereticus Inquisitor remaining behind the younger man. "We have arrived," he said. "A shuttle will conduct us to the High Lords. After that, it's all up to our herald to prove her case." Celestia gave a short nod before Matthias continued. This has been a most unusual mission. However, we have made it this far, and with the will of the Emperor to guide us we shall see it through. Until then, you know what has been asked of you." Matthias closed his eyes and hung his head. "The Emperor protects." "The Emperor protects." The Valhallans, Sister Bianca, Marcos, even Angelique chorused. There was a short pause before Marcos spoke. "Herald?" he asked. "Would you care to speak before we stand before the High Lords?" "All that needs to be said at this time is not for me to say," Celestia replied. "Rather, I have taken this time to meditate and prepare myself. Surely you would have no objection to this?" "Of course." Twilight noticed Marcos furrow his brow, but she refrained from speaking. Matthias broke the tension by stepping away from the Lord Inquisitor. "Celeste, if you would please follow me," he said. Celestia nodded and fell in place behind Matthias, Twilight and Matthias group hurrying to catch up. Marcos brought up the rear, his gaze still placed firmly on Celestia. "I have no idea what Lord Marcos has planned, and while I doubt it is a malicious scheme, it might tip the balance too far out of our control. Matthias' words caused Twilight to shiver. If these two could not work together, what would that say for those that Celestia hoped to help? There was a hiss of air as the ship opened to the outside, and Twilight choked as the door slid away and the air of Terra swept in. Having a dragon blowing smoke in her face was nothing compared to the smog of the planet, Twilight coughing for close to a minute as her lungs burned. Outside, the sky was blanketed by a yellow cloud of smoke. The only difference in the cloud was a brightened point Twilight guessed was where the sun was. Beneath that, a dark angular shape rose upward, smaller lights flickering along it as it disappeared into the smog. How can anyone live like this? As I said, much has changed since the heresy, Celestia whispered. I will explain later. For now, we have more pressing matters. Twilight raised an eyebrow before looking past Celestia and their escort. Assembled before the ramp were 5 soldiers dressed in black armor with red robes around their waists and arms. Their faces were hidden behind black and white helmets, with only glowing red slits to indicate where their eyes would be. One of them had broken off to speak with the 2 inquisitors, Matthias doing his best to keep his glowering to a minimum. Celestia stepped forward, Twilight following behind her. Is something the matter, my lords? She asked. Ah, Herald, Marcos stepped to one side to introduce the soldier. Sister Naomi of the Order of our Martyred Lady. She and her squad will be providing escort for us to the High Lords. Is that so? Celestia asked, turning her attention to the other woman. It is a pleasure to make your acquaintance, sister. Indeed. Naomi replied, her voice accented due to the mechanics of her helmet. Lord Marcos has told me of your mission. We shall see if your message really is all you say, and if you prove yourself to be a threat to my lord or the Imperium. Though Naomi said nothing more, her hand slid towards her side, where a chainsword and what appeared to be a combi weapon hung. Celestia seemed unimpressed, but Twilight could feel her nervousness welling up inside her once more. I am sure it will not come to that. Celestia replied, giving Naomi a smile before continuing. You need not worry, sister, the Emperor's trust was not unfounded when he asked me to carry his message. Naomi only gave a short grunt, stepping back to allow Lord Marcos to speak. As the Inquisitor spoke, Twilight noted that Sister Naomi and one of her fellows had shifted their gaze towards herself. Twilight said nothing, though even as she tried to turn her focus to the Inquisitor she could feel her eyes drifting back towards the sisters. Celestia and Matthias had told her of some humans' distrust for psychers. Perhaps these women were merely eyeing her with this distrust. If so, would they be so ready to listen to Celestia once she revealed herself? What exactly have you changed, Marcos? Matthias asked. You think that I am obstructing the will of the Emperor? Marcos replied, all but scoffing. Dear Matthias, I am not some heretic to be contrary to such matters. The sororitas will provide more protection than your henchmen could, and once we speak to the High Lords. We? I was under the impression that the High Lords would speak only to Celeste. Matters have changed, Inquisitor. If you seek to challenge me, you may speak with the rest of the Ordos to see where my orders come from. Celestia watched as Matthias' jaw tightened. As good of a man as he might have been, he seemed too easily angered when situations began to spiral out of his control. But then, Lord Marcos appeared to be going out of his way to pull this matter out of Matthias' hands. Such infighting would have to be dealt with. My lords, please, she said, catching the attention of both men. I believe we best set aside our bickering for now and move on. The High Lords will be expecting us, after all. Of course. Lord Marcos replied. Come, the shuttle that will take us to the High Lords is waiting. With that Marcos strode off, the sororitas squad forming up around Matthias' entourage before the remaining people started off after the man. Celestia kept her eyes forward, shifting them only to trace the dark outline that was the wall of the Imperial Palace. Even millennia after her departure, it had barely changed. The shuttle provided was nothing more than a modified Valkyrie transport, its weapons and most of its armor stripped away to provide more room for passengers. Celestia paused briefly. Valkyries were fine transports, but even with her disguise her armor would perhaps be a bit much for those traveling with her. Let's hope it is not too noticeable of a disturbance. The Inquisitors and Matthias' retinue stepped aboard first, with Celestia and Twilight following as the Sisters of Battle brought up the rear. Celestia paused again as the shuttle creaked slightly as she stepped aboard, but put it out of her mind as the others prepared for the journey. Celeste, Matthias said, catching Celestia's attention. There is no need for you to stand. The trip to the High Lords may take some time, and it might not be in our best interests if you were to tire yourself out. I will be fine, Celestia said, giving Matthias a smile. The Emperor has carried me this far, I do not feel that he shall allow me to falter now. Matthias merely nodded, stepping back so he could secure his own seat. The whine of engines rose as the transport took off, circling over the landing pad once before flying towards the palace. Soon, Celestia thought, closing her eyes and focusing her energy. She had little time for further contemplation before one of the sisters spoke. "Harold?" the woman asked. "May I ask you a question?" "You may," Celestia said, turning slightly to face the sisters. "Though I feel that it might be easier if I could speak to you face to face." There was another pause as the sister looked to her superior. Naomi gave a short nod in response, and the sister proceeded to remove her helmet to reveal a young woman not much older than Twilight, her white hair cut in a short bob and a ragged scar running from her forehead to her cheek. "What is your name, sister?" Celestia asked. "Ruth," the younger woman replied. "I have served the order faithfully my entire life." "I have no doubt that you have," Celestia said. "Now, there was something you wished to ask me?" Yes, Ruth's hand clenched slightly, and Celestia could tell the sister was fighting the urge to chew on her lip. "You serve the Emperor, you must have spoken to him in person." "I have." At this, Ruth's nervousness seemed to evaporate. "If I may ask, what was it like to stand in his presence? Long have I dreamed about the chance of seeing him, not just in death or in a vision but actually standing before him and witnessing his glory. What words did he say to you? Do you bear a mark of his presence? What visions did he?" "Ruth," Naomi snapped, drawing the sister's attention away from Celestia. "There is no need to drown the woman in questions." "Sorry," Sister Ruth mumbled. "I just wanted to know what it was like to stand before the Emperor." "I'm sure that is something we are all wondering," a second sister said. "But Sister Naomi has a point, if you ask too many questions now you will never be able to receive an answer." "I understand completely," Celestia said, raising a hand to calm the sisters. "And truly, I do not mind. I have dealt with far more trying matters than one who is curious." Ruth gave a short nod, her eyes still averted as Celestia continued. "But I assure you, standing before the Emperor is as glorious and awe-inspiring as you have been told. When he returns, I assure you that you will experience such glory for yourself." All the sisters of battle, not just Ruth, raised their heads at this. Ruth's eyes widened, her nervousness vanishing once more as she looked on at Celestia. After a pause, Ruth closed her eyes and smiled. "Thank you, Harold," she whispered. "That is all any of us could ask for." There was a pause before Ruth turned her attention towards Twilight. "And you? Have you seen the Emperor?" Yes. I guess I have." Twilight shifted in her seat for a moment. He seemed nice." At this, another one of the sisters let out a short giggle. "Do you have something to say, Judith?" Naomi asked. "No," Sister Judith said, working to suppress her giggles. "Just I was right. I told you all the Emperor was nice, but you all said no, he must be firm and commanding, he has no time for such small concerns. Well, guess I know more about the Emperor than all four of you." "If this is about that weird idea you have about bribing your way to become a canoness," Ruth started, to which Judith scoffed. "I would never do such a thing," she cried. "Though, since I asked them nicely the first time, maybe I can use this to become a canoness." "Sister Naomi?" "No, Judith." Naomi turned her head away. "If you want to become a canoness, you will have to prove yourself just like everyone else." Judith was about to speak again when Naomi continued. "And claiming divine knowledge is not a free pass." "But if it's from the Emperor, they will have to listen." Judith looked to Celestia. "Is that right, Harold? Can the Emperor make me a canoness?" "I cannot make any promises," Celestia said, giving a chuckle of her own. "But speak with him, and I am sure his favor will not be far off." Though she still wore a helmet, it was not hard to tell that Sister Judith was beaming. None of the other sisters seemed ready or willing to speak, and Celestia could understand, it was still quite a lot to take in, the possibility that one's God would be standing before them soon. Even if their God is not who they think, Celestia thought, closing her eyes, their faith will be more than enough to blossom into something greater. The flight to the great chamber of the Senatorum Imperialis had taken close to an hour, and all throughout this Matthias found himself growing more and more tense. His left hand clenched and unclenched, and a small bead of sweat formed across his brow. His focus was placed primarily on Marcos, the Lord Inquisitor focused on the looming structures ahead. The sororitas were a setback, sure enough. He knew that Lord Marcos would try something to take control of the search of the Emperor, and a squadron of battle sisters would certainly send a clear message of who was more capable between him and Matthias' troopers. Throughout the flight Marcos had listened closely to Celeste's conversation, even if he was not making it noticeable, picking up potential points of attack against her claim to the title of Herald, perhaps. Now what rested on Matthias' mind was what the Lord Inquisitor would try next. "We have arrived, my lords," the shuttle pilot called. Matthias nodded and rose to his feet, the others sans Celeste following suit. Marcos remained behind Matthias, though the young Inquisitor could all but feel the man's gaze on his shoulders. "Do not falter now. The fate of the Imperium is a greater weight than the scorn of one Inquisitor. Nikolai, make sure that you and the others find somewhere to rest until I have presented Celeste to the High Lords." The Valhallan nodded as Matthias cast a glance back towards Marcos. "Anything you wish to add, Lord Inquisitor?" "I suppose it would be in our best interest for me to accompany you before the High Lords," Marcos replied, giving Matthias a thin smile. "After all, they may wish to hear my own testimony of the events that have transpired. The sororitas will remain with your henchmen. Of course, more room for you to cast out among the minds of the administratum, then?" Matthias refrained from speaking to the Lord Inquisitor further before turning to address Celeste herself. "Well, are you ready?" "Of course, Matthias." Celeste nodded, giving him the hint of a smile beneath her hood. "Lead on, please." With that, Matthias turned towards the ramp and started down, Celeste following right behind him while the Valhallans and sororitas formed a ring around the entourage. The entrance leading to the Hall of the High Lords was just as Matthias had expected, a sweeping arch outlined with murals and carvings of past High Lords and great victories of the Imperium. Throngs of travelers and pilgrims milled about, ushered on by priests and lighter security details so they would not impede the paths of others. Finely dressed nobles and officers came and went, most going out of their way to avoid the common masses however they could. The air was thick with smog, conversation, and a host of smells Matthias did not wish to identify, yet the sweeping buildings above were more than enough to make one pause in awe. Most of his entourage certainly did, stopping for a moment as they craned their necks up to take in the design before them. Angelique mumbled something, swaying back and forth on her feet with her eyes fixated on Celeste, even as the older woman continued on unperturbed. "Suppose I will have to investigate the effect the Herald has on Angelique. Probably not dangerous, but I can't be too careful." Ahead, a smaller man stood before the main entrance to the Hall of the High Lords. Standing on either side of the entrance were two custodes, the gold-clad warriors staring out across the crowds. They barely seemed to notice as Matthias and company approached. "I request access to the Senatorum chambers." "And who might you be?" the small man asked. "Matthias Velas of the Ordo Xenos." Matthias gestured towards Celeste. "I come bearing a woman who possesses information regarding the whereabouts of the Emperor." "Oh, of course." The man turned slightly as a cherub drifted out of the shadows, the small servitor carrying a scroll in its arms. The man pulled a part of the scroll down, scanning it for a moment before turning back to Matthias. "Yes, the High Lords have granted you an audience, though due to delays in proceeding I ask that you return in a week's time." "I was told that our meeting would be today," Matthias replied, his left hand tightening slightly. "I understand, sire," the man replied. "But as the High Lords of Terra are the heart and soul of the Imperium, beneath the Emperor himself, it seems inappropriate that we should disregard their wishes." Matthias' jaw tightened. It would be like the bureaucrats to delay his mission further. "I respect the authority of the High Lords," he said finally. "But as a member of the Holy Ordos, my word is second to the Emperor. I am bringing forth vital information regarding his return, and by the authority vested upon me I order you to allow me and my entourage through to speak to the High Lords." The man hesitated, so Matthias glared at him. "Would you care to delay the Ordos any further?" "Of course not, my lord," the man said, turning back to the cherub and scrawling down a message on the scroll. "The cherub will conduct you to the High Lords." "Thank you. May the Emperor's blessings follow you." With that Matthias pressed on, though in his rush to continue to the High Lords he failed to notice the custodes shift ever so slightly as Celeste glided past. "A little brusque today, are we?" Lord Marcos asked. "We do the Emperor's work," Matthias said. "And we must deal swiftly with all who would impede our progress." He looked back towards Celeste. Her body language had not changed in the slightest, but even from beneath her hood Matthias could tell she was glaring. Anger and frustration all but radiated off her, and Matthias found himself shivering slightly as he looked away. None of the terrors of the galaxy had ever caused Matthias to waver as he did around Celeste. What was it with that woman that would create such fear? "They have forgotten my command." Celestia did not bother to look up as she and the others entered the main chambers of the High Lords. She ignored the splendor of mankind's achievements, even the giant statue of her fallen son Rogel Dorn did not catch her eye. "They have forgotten my command." When she had first ascended, she had hoped the guidance of the Space Marines would help in rebuilding the Imperium following her departure. They knew her commands best, they would be listened to. But with the bureaucracy as oppressive as ever, Terra still a polluted hellhole, the Inquisition still turning on one another whenever the chance arose, and the Astartes nowhere to be found, the situation was perfectly clear. They have forgotten my command. Inside, Celestia knew she could not be too harsh. The Imperium was still under attack from all sides, and the institutions of man were still needed. And it had been some time since her departure, it was not too far-fetched to see the system break down. But she was still human, she could still feel frustration towards her people. The trick was not allowing it to consume her further. Who comes now before the High Lords? A voice called as Celestia, Matthias, and Marcos continued on. She could feel Twilight and the others ushered away to seats, but put it out of mind for now. I am Inquisitor Matthias Velas of the Ordo Xenos, the younger man said. I stand before you with possible evidence to the location of the Emperor. There are squadrons of Imperial vessels scouring the galaxy for the Emperor, another High Lord said. What makes you believe that you have found him? It is wild conjecture, lords. Celestia turned her head slightly as Marcos stepped forth. A witch under young Matthias' care made the claim that the Emperor had placed a herald within territory controlled by the Vile Tau Empire. Upon arriving, we found this woman, he gestured towards Celestia, who claimed to be the herald. As a loyal servant of the Ordo Hereticus, I have watched her these past months and have found no reason behind such claims. Would not the Emperor arrive in person, rather than sending a herald through the territory of our enemies? This woman knows much, my lords, Matthias offered. If she is who she says she is, it would be in defiance of the Emperor to turn her away. Even if she is not, she may hold some information to the true herald's location. Your concerns have been logged. The first High Lord said. Now then, will the woman please step forward and plead her case? The two Inquisitors looked to Celestia, who gave them a small nod. As they moved behind her, Marcos leaned in slightly. Once you fail to convince the lords, he said. I look forward to torturing your true identity, witch. Speak further, and you will never again see the Emperor's light. Celestia growled. Killing Marcos would be impractical, even when she had revealed herself, but the threat would get him to back down for a little while. Who comes before the High Lords, bearing the shelter of the Holy Ordos? The first High Lord said. I am many things, Celestia said, raising her head slightly so she could look upon the lords without casting off her hood. Now, I take the role as a herald of dark times. I have watched the Imperium, seen how its enemies close in around it, tearing at its borders like wild dogs ripping a corpse. Xenos of all kinds slaughter our citizens with impunity, the dark powers of chaos may appear dormant but are on the rise, and sections of the Imperium remain in squalor. And where have you been, you great lords? When have you answered the cry of humanity? I beg your pardon? One lord asked. Who are you to judge our actions? Another said. We have all served the Imperium faithfully. No, you have not. Celestia cast her glance along the row of lords. Whether you realize it or not, you have all failed the Imperium in some way. All men fall victim to their grudges, their preferences, their base desires that cloud the seat of judgment. And in doing so, you have neglected the very thing that makes the Imperium strong, its people, its worlds. A murmur had rose through the crowds watching over the proceedings. Good, let them speak. You are trying our patience, woman. The First Lord growled. We act as the voice of the Imperium, not you. It is we who decide what is just, not you. And it is we who will decide your fate for belittling and defying this most sacred of institutions. But you will not, Celestia smirked, for you still wish to know the secret that I hold. The secret to the Emperor's return. Silence fell over the hall for a moment before Celestia continued. I can tell you that he is near, drawing closer to Terra with each passing hour. And you failed to tell the Ordos Xenos and Hereticus this? One of the High Lords said. Not by choice, mind you. Celestia replied. The Emperor entrusted me to lead him in, as one would lead a child down a road. You would compare the God Emperor to a child? The second High Lord cried. And by what authority do you claim this? The first said. Remove your hood and tell us all whose authority you truly serve. Silence reigned once again. Celestia's eyes darted from one lord to the next, taking in every line and emotion set on their faces. Well, if you insist. With a small smile, Celestia raised her hands and gripped the edge of her hood, pausing for just a moment to make sure that she had the High Lord's attention before dropping the illusion. The cloak dropped away, forming into a magnificent red cape that cascaded down golden armor. As if caught by wind, her hair spilled down over her shoulders, tucking around every crease and ridge in her armor. Sword and claw were revealed, gleaming as bright as they had when she had called the Great Crusade. The High Lords drew back in shock, the murmur of the call rising to crescendo as the illusion fell away. "Look now, you lords of Terra," she said, her voice carrying through the hall. "I am the light of humanity, returned from the darkness of the warp. For thousands of years you have waited, watching the signs for me, but now you need not worry. Though my form is changed, my speech softer, know that I am your emperor, and I have returned to restore the Imperium to its rightful place in the galaxy." The murmuring continued, dozens of spectators questioning themselves as they looked on. The High Lords took the news much better than Celestia had anticipated. "Blasphemy!" one shrieked. "You would dare profane the Emperor's holy image with your cheap parlor tricks?" asked another. "You are a heretic," cried a third. "A heretic and a traitor. What made you think that any of us would accept the Emperor returned as a woman?" They continued to cry out objections and accusations, even as Celestia drew her head down and closed her eyes. "I had thought you would not believe," she said. "It takes more than common sight to do so. Now, open your souls, and behold my majesty." With that, Celestia reached out a hand, a golden light enveloping it before all in the room froze. In that instance, they saw Celestia for who she was, her past among the ancient lands of Terra, her rise and fall at the dawn of the Imperium, her return to throw back the tides of chaos. Her entire life played out across their minds, details and events all collecting into an image of their ruler. She took care to sequester her memories of Equestria. There was no need to drag her ponies further into the Imperium. Celestia slowly lowered her hand, motion once again returning among the High Lords and the crowds. "Now, do you see?" she asked. There was another lengthy pause, all eyes fixated on the High Lords, who in turn started down at Celestia. Finally, one of the lords, the ecclesiarch, if she recalled correctly, stood up from his chair, gazing down at Celestia for a moment before speaking. "I cannot deny what I saw," he said. "Hail, for the Emperor has returned." Celestia closed her eyes again, listening as each Lord of Terra rose and proclaimed a similar message. The message spread quickly, all of those present rising to their feet to proclaim the message of the Emperor's return. Only Marcos remained silent, them man surveying the room for a moment before stalking towards the exit. His frustration was noted, but would be dealt with later. The anger of one man paled to the joy at the Emperor's return. Chapter 1.11, Praise and Condemnation. Twilight arched her back as she woke up, sheets tumbling off her body into a heap on the ground. Even though the room she had been provided was almost the size of the ground floor of her library, and the bed far larger and more comfy than the one she had aboard the Sanguinium Martyrs, she was still having trouble sleeping. Every one of her joints and muscles seemed out of place, crackling as she tried stretching out. The window on the far side of the room would have given Twilight an impressive view of the palace and Terra beyond, but all she could see was smog and a few blinking lights to direct air traffic. Still, Twilight found herself staring at the smog cloud as she got dressed. Perhaps it was in the vain hope that she would see something, anything beyond the veil, or perhaps it was merely a reminder of just where she was. Who knows how far from home, in a universe that by all accounts wants to kill me, and nothing secure to fall back on. Twilight though as she finished the last of the clasps to her new robes. At least I still have the princess. Fully dressed, Twilight stepped away from the window and out into the hall, taking a moment to catch her breath as she adjusted to the change in the air of the main hallway. For all its splendor, the Imperial Palace seemed rather short on several basic needs, consistent air filtration being one of them. The hallway stretched on for as far as Twilight could see, disappearing into a haze of shadow and what she hoped was incense smoke. It had been a flurry of activity since the meeting with the High Lords. Matthias and his team had disappeared, leaving Twilight alone amongst a sea of curious and reverent passers-by. Sister Naomi and her squad had helped, forming up around Twilight as they escorted her further into the palace, but in the process Celestia had disappeared within her own crowd of adoring subjects. Not even her appearances back in Equestria drew in such fervor, but then, directly worshipping Celestia as a god was more of the exception, not the norm. Twilight started off down the hall to her left, the sound of her shoes against the floor echoing far down the hall. Windows to the outside world were soon replaced by statues and tapestries, images of heroes and leaders long since past looming over her. The most prominent, and perhaps eye-catching, was one of what Twilight assumed was Celestia's old form, a powerful man standing triumphantly over a fallen dragon. Whoever had made the tapestry had obviously taken great care in creating the piece, dozens of minute details hidden away beneath every line and curve of the figures. Still, the stern gaze of the Emperor sent a chill down Twilight's back, and she quickly averted her eyes as she continued forward. In turning about, she almost smacked into sisters Ruth and Judith coming the other way. "Oh, I'm sorry," Twilight said, backing up slightly from the sororitas. "The fault is all ours. Ruth replied, giving a quick shake of her head. We were the ones not paying attention, and in our inattentiveness we failed to notice you had been wandering outside your quarters. I noticed her, Judith said, but Ruth ignored her. Regardless, we have come to ask you if there is anything you need, and if Ruth's face flushed red before she mumbled the rest of her request. Am I really that intimidating? Twilight thought before giving the sororitas a smile. Enough time spent around Fluttershy had taught her how to deal with shy people. There's no need to rush, she said. Just ask me what you want when you're ready. She's usually the more forceful one. Judith chirped. Sister Naomi usually keeps her held back when we need to make requisitions. There was an incident with an administratum adept that got out of hand. Ruth's face flushed red, only this time from anger instead of embarrassment. He was impeding the holy work of our sisters, she cried, turning back to face Judith. Had he continued, all of those people would have been lost to the cultists. You still didn't have to brain him with his servo skull, though. Judith countered. The poor thing wasn't doing anything wrong. Hey now, there's no need to start arguing, Twilight said, raising her hands to catch the sororitas' attention. We're all still friends, right? So maybe we can just set this aside for now and I can help you with whatever it was that you wanted me to help with. There was a pause as Ruth's earlier anger faded. You are right, she straightened up and gave a small nod. Apologies, my lady, it was inappropriate for me to act in such a way. That's all right, Twilight's smile was replaced with confusion for a moment. Why my lady? You're the Emperor's personal student, Judith said. Or I guess it's Empress now. But as her personal student, you carry the same standing and power as one of the High Lords themselves. I do? That's how Sister Naomi explained it when we were debriefed following the Empress' return. Ruth added. As such, we are required to show you the same respect as we would any High Lord of the Imperium, even if they did call the Empress a heretic and blasphemer. Oh, there was another pause before Twilight spoke again. Well, you don't really have to be so official with me. Really? Both sisters asked. Yes. I mean, sure I might have been trained by the Empress, but I'm still just another human like you too. You can just call me Tara if you'd like. There was another pause before Judith giggled. Is there something wrong with that? I'm not used to these sorts of things, and there are times when I kind of stumble over what I'm supposed to do and I embarrass myself. It's not that. Judith said. It's just Tara. No disrespect, but your parents must have really been seeking the Empress' favor when they named you that. At this, Ruth responded by slapping Judith in the back of the head, a metallic clang ringing off the sororitas' helmet. How dare you mock the Empress' chosen student, Ruth cried. I'm not trying to mock her, but it's Tara, and she's on Tara. This received another slap from Ruth. Okay, maybe I did deserve that one. Sometimes it's a wonder why you haven't been smote for your antics. Ruth grumbled, taking a moment to compose herself before speaking again. Forgive Judith. She's Judith. I understand. Twilight replied. Was there something you wanted to ask me earlier? Oh, why yes. Ruth nodded a few times before speaking. We were hoping that if you are free from your duties to the Empress, of course we were hoping that you would join us for our morning prayer. There was a pause as Ruth's blush returned. We understand if you say no. Far be it for us to impede on the work of the Empress, and as you are her student that work must be very great indeed as I think on it. Perhaps this was a bad idea. Sorry for disturbing you, my lady. Ruth hurriedly bowed and made to leave, but Twilight stepped forward to stop her. Wait, she said. There's no need to be embarrassed. I would love a chance to join you and your sisters. Really? Ruth asked, before trying her best to compose herself. I mean, thank you for honoring us with your presence. If you would please follow us, we will conduct you to our quarters. Twilight gave a small nod as she fell in step with the sisters, the tapestries and paintings flicking by as they walked. I can keep working at trying to make them less formal, Twilight thought. It couldn't hurt, could it? So, Ruth, Twilight started. You said that you've always served your order is the right term? Yes. Ruth nodded. I never knew my parents. The sisters always told me that my mother was a young underhiver who could not care for me, so she gave me to the church in hopes that I could live a better life. The first words I spoke were praises to the Emperor. The first texts I read were the writings of great saints and heroes. She looked over to Twilight. But I would never trade it for an instant. My sisters and I have done good work, battling against those that would see the Imperium in ruins, and even if I must give my life in service it will ensure that others do not have to do the same. Oh. There was a pause before Twilight spoke again. I can see why having this opportunity to see the Empress I can see why it means so much to you. She's a bit more vocal than most, Judith said. We all wept for joy when we learned we were being brought to Terra, but Ruth wept for 2 days after we got our orders, and again when the Empress revealed herself, and again when Judith, Ruth growled. I'm not saying it's a bad thing. You're just very fervent in expressing your faith, and that's a good thing. Ruth looked away, though at least she was calm again. Twilight now turned her attention towards Judith, the other sister shrinking away slightly. I'm not judging my sister's faith, she is a loyal servant of the Imperium, probably even a better servant than I will ever be. I'm not judging you. Twilight replied. You just seem a bit scattered? Ruth suggested. Judith has always been like that, ever since she showed up in the barracks brimming with delusions of grandeur. It shouldn't be right to place so much optimism in her life and abilities. My parents always taught me that the Emperor was like a stern father, Judith said. He may discipline you and place you in trials, but he is always doing so for the betterment of you and your family, and he is ready to catch you should you stumble. Though she still wore her helmet, it was not hard for Twilight to tell that Judith was smiling. It always made a little more sense than the priests who said we were only martyrs in training. Ruth gave a small huff at this, but otherwise made no comment. So, you knew your parents? Twilight asked. They worked to maintain the shrines on my homeworld, Judith said. That was fine, but I felt the Emperor calling me to new pastures, so when the order passed through our hab block, I walked up to the leading sister and asked if she would make me a canoness. She laughed at me, but said if I worked at it I could become a canoness one day. Next thing I know I've joined the order, and with Sister Naomi's tutelage I like to think that I'm well on my way to becoming a canoness. The day you become a canoness is the day every single heretic and traitor drops dead. Ruth muttered. Oh, that would be nice. Maybe helping the Empress might be just what I need. Ruth still seemed on edge, but Judith's cheer was unwavering. Twilight was unsure of what to make of the sister, but she seemed harmless enough that interacting with her would not lead to too much trouble. But when has that been true in your life, Twilight? The section that they moved into now was more Spartan than the halls around Twilight's quarters. There were still depictions of old battles and heroes, but they were much smaller and simpler in design, and much fewer in number. The hall was lit solely by small flickering lights. The choral music the Imperium seemed to favor was certainly louder as they went on. The two sisters seemed calmer, but like Matthias and his company they seemed adept at hiding their emotions from Twilight as they continued. At least I got to see a little emotion earlier. The sisters led Twilight to a smaller room just off of a second hall. Ruth was the first to enter, Judith taking time to remove her helmet to reveal a young, round-faced woman with twin fleur-de-lis tattoos over her eyebrows. We've returned, and brought the Empress student with us. Oh? There was a pause as a third sister stepped from the dark. This one was leaner than her fellows, her hair tied back in a neat bun, and she greeted Twilight with a warm smile and a bow. Welcome, my lady. It is an honor to have a chance to speak with you in person. Thanks, Twilight returned the smile. What's your name? Rebecca, my lady. Rebecca rose back to her full height before continuing. I assume you are here for morning prayer. Have you eaten? My sister and I have prepared a small meal, but there should be enough for you as well. Oh, I wouldn't want to intrude. Please, I insist. Rebecca reached forth to take Twilight's hand, leading her further into the room. I do not wish you to go without, my lady, though as the Empress student I am sure you are attended to in the highest regard. I would like a real apple sometime, but I've come to avoid keeping my hopes up for now. I've managed, Twilight said. But you don't have to call me lady all the time. Terra will be just fine. A short snicker came from behind Twilight, followed by the sound of Ruth's armor-clad hand smacking Judith's skull. Well then, Terra, I hope you enjoy the modest arrangements we sisters have prepared. Rebecca led Twilight to a small circle of 5 mats set next to a shrine lit with 5 candles. Judith and Ruth took the spots at the far left and right respectively, while Rebecca bade Twilight to sit in the center before taking a seat between her and Ruth. Sister Naomi is speaking to the ecclesiarch currently, so you may have her seat until she returns, Rebecca said. Oh, thank you. Twilight took a moment to make herself comfortable before speaking again. Is this normal for you? No. Ruth shook her head. Our morning rituals are usually conducted in a large mess hall with hundreds of other sisters. It's a rare moment when we get a chance to sit and pray together, and even then Naomi usually makes it a point to settle logistics after we have given our praise to the Emperor. Empress. Judith corrected. Right. Ruth furrowed her brow. That is not going to get easier anytime soon. Don't worry, dear, Rebecca placed a hand on Ruth's shoulder. You are a sister of the Order of Our Martyred Lady, and one of the most devout young women I have met. I doubt you will stumble over a simple change in titles. I know. There was a pause just as a fourth sister stepped into the room. "Oh, we have a guest?" Twilight turned and saw another sister carrying a small platter of food, one who looked almost exactly like Rebecca save for shorter hair, a stockier build, and a fleur-de-lis on her left cheek. "Hello, my lady. My name is Veronica, and I suppose you have already met my sisters." "Yes." Twilight nodded. "Although are you and Rebecca related?" "Twins," Rebecca said. "The firstborn in our home in nearly a millennia. We were always considered blessed by the Emperor, so when the Order arrived searching for recruits we were among the first sought out. They decided separating us would be detrimental, so we were placed in the same training regiment and eventually the same squad. As we have saved the lives of many of our sisters, and each other, I would say that the Empress does smile upon us." Veronica took her spot next to Twilight's left and set the platter down. "Now, would you like to say a short blessing?" Twilight froze. The religion of the Imperium was certainly fascinating, but aboard Matthias' ship their rituals were conducted in private and Twilight had never had the chance to study them too closely. Furthermore, the sisters were a different aspect of the Imperium than Matthias and his followers. What if something they found detestable was something the latter considered the norm? Is something wrong, Tara?" Rebecca asked. Twilight's face flushed red as her nervousness welled up. "Sorry, I don't know what to say, I've never done this before." Silence reigned in the room, the sisters looking to one another in surprise and confusion. "Never?" Judith asked. "No. I mean, nothing like this, I just got so wrapped up in my studies that I got distracted." It was a lame excuse, but it was the truth. "But Ruth started. You are the student of the Empress. How can you not know blessings?" Twilight had no time to respond before Veronica pulled her into a tight embrace. "Oh, you poor thing," she cried, holding Twilight like a mother would hold a crying child. To be so close to the Empress light, and yet so far at the same time, that sounds like the worst form of confusion that can be inflicted on any of mankind. I guess Twilight stammered as Veronica pulled away. "This will not stand, a student of Her Holiness should not be so blind." She looked now to the other sororitas. "Sisters, it must be our solemn duty to instruct Tara here in our ways and prayers. She must not be one to venture into the torrents of the galaxy without the light of the Empress to guide her." "Yes." Rebecca nodded. "I have some of my old hymnals from my training, she can borrow those if she would like." "You really don't have to do all this for me," Twilight started again, only to be silenced by a finger to her lips. "We sisters of the Order of our Martyred Lady are trusted to protect and guide the faithful of humanity against the terrors of the galaxy," Veronica said. "It matters not if you are an Underhiver, or the greatest of lords, we all have a duty to the people of the Imperium, and in this form that duty is to make sure you are ready to stand against all that would see mankind undone." Twilight hesitated for a moment. She chewed her lip, unsure of what to say as the sisters looked on. At Celestia's side she would be kept busy, and certainly her mentor would do her utmost to protect her. But then, she had always loved the chance to learn, and there might be times when Celestia could not always watch over her. "I thank you," Twilight said finally. "I would love to learn more about you and your lives." This received another squeeze from Veronica. "That's wonderful, Tara," she said. "We'll talk to Sister Naomi when she returns, but I'm sure she would be happy to teach you." "Teach who what?" The voice of Naomi cut through the sisters' conversation. All eyes turned to the Sister Superior as she stepped into the room. She was still wearing her helmet, but she did look less intimidating without her weapons. "Oh, I did not realize the Empress student was present. We were just planning on teaching Tara a little more about our order," Rebecca said. "By your permission, of course, Sister Naomi." "Not by mine," Naomi said, stepping further into the room as the sisters and Twilight rose to their feet. "I just spoke with the Ecclesiarch, he has reasoned that the Empress student should be placed under our protection, as there may be times when the Empress' great works will not require the student's presence." "Oh," Twilight blinked. "I was actually just thinking that over. Thank you." "Please, there is no need for thanks," Naomi raised her hand. "We merely do the duty charged to us. Now, I would like a moment's rest, please, we may discuss arrangements once I am ready." Twilight could do nothing but give a small nod as Naomi slipped past her into the adjoining room. There was a pause before she turned back to the other sisters. "She seemed nice," she said, mentally slapping herself for letting her sarcasm slip through. "Does she always wear her helmet around?" It is different with Naomi," Ruth said. "She always wears her helmet when surrounded by those not of our squad. It would be best if we do not discuss it without her." "Oh, I can respect that." Twilight took a moment to straighten herself out before Rebecca spoke. "She will come around though. the sister said before smiling. Now let us eat. I've always found it difficult to focus on an empty stomach. Matthias had been surprised to find out there was a tavern within the Imperial Palace. It was obviously not in the original design, perhaps an old storage room some bored High Lord had reserved for a private stash, or pilgrims making use of some misplaced surplus. Whatever the case, the tavern was run down, held together with corrugated metal and old planks, and smelled vaguely of promethium. And yet that was where Matthias found himself, answering the question of what happened when a Hospitaller, a Psyker, and two Valhallans walked into a bar. Alexis was in the center, flanked by Nikolai and Bianca. The trooper's head rested on the bar, a collection of alcoholic beverages surrounding him. Angelique was not far from Bianca, idly spinning her chair about as she hummed some old drinking song. I go away to pray for 10 minutes, and this is what happens? Matthias took a moment to compose himself before approaching his team. Lord Matthias, Bianca said, straightening up as Matthias entered. I apologize, but I needed to make sure all of my charges were accounted for. Is it Inquisitor? Alexis slurred, weakly trying to raise his head. Good. I MMA die now, he'll help. How long has he been here? Matthias asked, taking a seat next to Nikolai. 2 hours. Nikolai replied. Sister Bianca arrived for the latter half of that time. Fortunately, I've managed to keep him to weaker drinks. How'd Pius die, chopped up or something by Horus? Alexis hiccuped. That THA's no fun, THA's how'll be. And why has Alexis decided to get drunk in the Imperial Palace? She was there. Alexis pulled his head up, his hands hovering in front of him. Had a cute smile, nice round face, great rack, you know how long I's been since I've had a girl? The desert remains dry, and sees no rain even for 10 seasons. Angelique sang before spinning again. Alexis slumped forward. Now Empress gonna kill me cause I hit on her student, the Valhallan moaned. Shoot me, Lord, is better the way, Matthias sighed. The last thing he needed was for a drunken henchman to make a further mess of himself. I'm certain the Empress needs you alive more than she needs you dead, Matthias said. And it matters not, we have work to do. All work. Always work, Angelique murmured. The Inquisition wants us to hold here and continue our service to the Empress. Which means watch her to make sure she is who she is. Nikolai finished. Exactly. Matthias gave a small sigh before continuing. I am certain that she is the Emperor reborn, but there are those who remain uncertain, certainly those that are capable of swaying plenty of people. Maybe one of those Eldar will come and kill me. Who? Bianca asked, looking over Alexis' slumped form. The Phalanx just left the Armageddon system, and the main Minotaur battlefleet entered the Segmentum Solar 2 weeks ago. Matthias looked ahead. If she is truly the Emperor, she will be able to convince the Adeptus Astartes with no trouble. And if she doesn't? Hopefully the Custodes and Terra's garrison can placate the Astartes long enough for the Empress to win them over, Matthias sighed again. Have faith, though, you all saw what she showed us, and perhaps the Space Marines can be convinced. Maybe she'll do Pius thing again, unvolunteered. The Raven will speak for the light, Angelique said. Matthias watched as the Psyker rose to her feet, staring off into the distance. I can feel the Raven, he waits within the sun's embrace, yet he cannot see her light. It will be the mare that leads him in from the rain. Angelique, Bianca placed a hand on the girl's shoulder. Your prophecies are not needed right now. Wait. Matthias waved Bianca off before approaching Angelique. I've noticed that you refer to the Empress as the light. Is that correct? He asked, yet he is all-knowing. Angelique rolled her head around. The eye sees all, why ask a small spark for the answer? Because I want to know, who is the Raven? There was a long pause, Angelique blinking at Matthias for a few moments. Ask the light, and she will answer. The mare will follow to the Raven, and he will follow her into the light. End of chapter 1.11, Praise and Condemnation.